Hello again and good evening from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I wrote on April the 2nd and 4th an informal essay about the effort and the need to break ethnic myths, specifically about the Western immigrants in the Philippines. I'm one of them. I'm from Finland, which is an independent, or at least officially an independent, democratic and parliamentary republic in Northern Europe, bordered by Russia in the east, Sweden in the west, Norway in the north, and Estonia in the south. It belongs to that basically federalist economic, political, military and social organization known as the European Union. That is why its independence, given the fact that it is a rather northern and isolated country and a notably sparsely populated one. It's 338,000 odd square kilometers are occupied by only about 5.5 million people, which means that there's a lot of empty space in Finland. Anyway, also given the fact that it is an active member of the European Union, and its political leadership does not really criticize the European Union's leadership, we may of course argue about the extent to which Finland is factually independent, but then again that would apply to many other, if not most other, European Union member states. Of course not to Britain, because it's on its way out of the European Union. So the purpose of this essay is to help many Filipino students and teachers to relate properly to the Western-born immigrants who they meet at school or elsewhere. So a definition: Western-born means born in one of the following countries or continents: Australia, New Zealand, Europe, or North America. Of course, we must always remember that a significant minority of the people of Western origin are born outside the above countries and continents. In the rest of Oceania, for example in Palau, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Samoa, Micronesia, Solomon Islands, and Marshall Islands. And then Latin America, from Mexico and the Bahamas in the north to Argentina and Chile in the south, in Africa, and of course here in Asia, including the Philippines. In this issue, I try to correct certain misunderstandings, myths and stereotypes about us, Western immigrants who live and work, for example, teach here in the Philippines. Currently, I am a part-time teacher or tutor. This Monday, on April the 4th, on April the 2nd, I started to work in one part-time teaching or tutoring work, teaching 3 students of Korean birth French in one of the many learning centers of Metro Manila. And next Tuesday, on April the 10th, I will start working in another learning center. I'm scheduled to teach 1 student English, and then later on possibly more subjects will be added to that work. And of course I really will have to push hard to get a new full-time teaching work somewhere in Metro Manila, preferably at a college or a university, even though under some circumstances even a high school is acceptable by August. hopefully already by June or July. Okay. Yes, okay. The essay is a bit weirdly structured. Anyway, I belong to a small ethnic minority here in the Philippines. There are maybe only between 100 and 200 Finns living here in the Philippines, and I assume most of them live here in Metro Manila. And because I am an international-minded immigrant, and especially one who belongs to such a small ethnic minority, I am concerned about how we Western immigrants are perceived by Filipinos. Of course, we have to remember that given the basically uniform and universal characteristic or condition of the human nature, these prejudices and stereotypes exist all across the ethnic spectrum and all across the so-called racial spectrum. In other words, people have a tendency to be judgmental and prejudiced and stereotypizing about and towards the people who look different, who behave differently or strangely compared to themselves, who speak other or strange languages, who profess different religions or belong to different churches, who practice different lifestyles, etc. So that is, of course, human. It's very common, it's very natural, but also very sad. Because it often prevents people from meeting each other as equals. In other words, the stereotypes often make people of one group consider themselves as better, more suitable, more normal, or more valuable than people of one or more other groups. So, one final note before I begin this essay's actual pedagogical part. I prefer to write the adjective racial in quotation marks. Why? Because the races are fairly arbitrary and to some extent overlapping categories into which the humans are still sometimes divided. We now have had, by this time, some or even several centuries of recorded human history, where there are at least some written records available. And the so-called races have mixed through intermarriages and through other intimate interpersonal relationships. So, especially now in the early 21st century, we can confidently declare that there are no pure races. Because there are, for all practical purposes, no pure ethnic groups. There has been some mixture of ethnic origins and definitely of the so-called racial origins during the human history. And already because of migration. People moving in and moving out. So personally, when I use the term race, I prefer to divide the humans into 6 racial groups, which of course are not, or who of course are not always easy to distinguish from each other. Okay, slight correction, grammatical correction to my essay. The whites, such as myself, the blacks, the yellow-skinned people who are supposed to dominate Eastern Asia, countries such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, or former Burma. Sorry. Of course, then China and Mongolia, and then North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. Then the red-skinned people, traditionally the North American natives, who used to be called Indians and Eskimos, but now natives or aboriginals or First Nations, as in Canada. And then Métis in Western Canada. Traditionally, the Métis have been descendants of Europeans, especially people of French origin, and Aboriginals. And then the Inuit, even though there are more groups of the people whom we called Eskimos earlier than the Inuit, even though the Inuit then are one of the most prominent groups. And then we have brown-skinned people and dark-skinned people. Sorry. And already here in the Philippines, of course, we see people of many different shades of skin color. All the way from very black-skinned people to very white-skinned people, probably even whiter-skinned people than I, because I often go out to walk for exercise when I have the opportunity to do so. According to my Finnish and Northern European eyes, I have noticed that some Filipinos are just about as fair-skinned as many of us white people. Of course, those Filipinos must have some European, North American, Australian, or New Zealander, or possibly in some cases white South African heritage. While some are notably dark, even black by their skin color, especially as far as their facial color is concerned. Most Filipinos have some shade of brown skin color, whether light brown or dark brown. I belong to the so-called white people. As we know, the whites form the majority racial group in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Of course, significant populations of white people live even outside these continents and countries, as I have already described in this essay. Most of us, and this is very important to remember here in the Philippines especially, or for example, most of us white people live outside North America. I know that especially in colloquial Tagalog, it's common to call white-skinned people as Kanos or Americanos, even though a significant minority of them are not Americans. And even among the American whites, there are people from many different, at least tens of different ethnic origins. Europe has over 700 million people, including Western Russia, which is classified as a part of Eastern Europe. If we use the narrow political and linguistic definition of North America as including only Canada and the United States, then North America has over 360 million people. Australia has over 20 million people. And New Zealand has over 4 million people. And of course, Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand have also racial minorities, such as Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and then Oceanians or fellow Oceanians from other Oceanian countries in Australia and New Zealand. Relatively few Oceanians proportionately live in Europe or North America, even though such minorities exist, and they probably are gradually growing. And then Aboriginals or native people in North America. In Australia they are called Aborigines. In New Zealand they are called the Maori or Maoris. And then people who do not fit neatly into any of even the above 6 racial categories. So they are truly of mixed racial background. In the United States, the demographic or population trends indicate that during this 21st century, the traditional white Americans who can trace their ethnic origins to Europe will probably become a minority. Because especially the Hispanic American population is growing. People of Latin American origin, although of course there are also Spanish and Portuguese immigrants and their children living in the United States. And since the Hispanic Americans can be of any so-called race, some of them, of course, could be classified as whites, some, of course, as dark people, some as brown people, and some even as black people, especially those who come from the Caribbean. And then some who come from, for example, Brazil. Brazil, which has a very ethnically and racially mixed population, as of course do various other multi-ethnic countries. Think of the United States and Canada and South Africa and Britain, France, and Germany. And of course, here in Asia, for example, India, even China, and then notably Indonesia. They are ethnically and racially mixed countries. And then the percentage of African Americans who used to be called Negroes and who are still alternately called blacks based on their basic skin color, their percentage of the overall US population is also rising, however, not quite as quickly as that of the Hispanics. Due to, well, the continued influx of Hispanic Americans into the United States. No wonder that President Trump wants to have the border wall constructed along the US-Mexican border. And then birth rates still remain high among Hispanic Americans, although they are also relatively high still among African Americans. However, the death rate among African Americans is somewhat higher than among the white or Caucasian Americans. And then in Canada, the ethno-racial mix-up is somewhat different. Yes, I should note that there is also a recognizable and gradually growing minority of Asian Americans in the United States. That so-called racial minority is heavily concentrated in the metropolises or big cities and their suburbs. As of course, to some extent, are portions of the Hispanic American and African American minorities, but they are overall still more evenly spread throughout the United States than are the Asian Americans. And another factor, yes, there is immigration from Asian countries to the United States, but a significant minority of the immigrants will not stay in the United States. There are students who want to earn their university or college, or possibly theological seminary degrees, or postgraduate degrees, and then once they have achieved those degrees, they will return to their native lands. And Asian Americans overall have lower birth rates than do the Hispanic and African Americans, which also keeps their percentage of the overall US population relatively low. But in Canada, the people of European origin clearly dominate the population. So people principally of British, Irish, and French origin, although there are also significant German, Italian, Polish, and Ukrainian minorities, for example. Anyway, during this century, according to the Canadian demographics trends, if I have a correct impression of them, they are unlikely to challenge the European Canadians' demographic majority, at least even nearly as much as the Hispanic and African American demographic groups in the United States. However, the percentage of such visible minorities, in other words, people of ethno-racial minority groups who look clearly different from the white or Caucasian Canadians, most notably, of course, Africans and Asians, is gradually increasing in Canada's population. And in Canada, even more than in the United States, especially the African and Asian minorities are heavily concentrated in the metropolises and their suburbs. Well, even Europe, where I come from, more specifically from Northern Europe, which includes more white people than North America, has notable racial minorities, especially Asians and Africans. And a significant portion, probably even majority, of Europe's Asian minority is from Western Asia, which is more commonly called the Middle East. Although a portion of the Middle East is also in North Africa. And likewise of Europe's African-born population, a significant portion is from North America, although there are also significant numbers of Western, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africans. And as in North America, they are quite heavily concentrated in the big cities and their surrounding metropolitan areas. And because in most European countries the birth rates are so low that in some or several countries the population is actually falling, most of those countries are located in Eastern Europe. And in my native land, Finland, the population is growing now, according to last year's figures, by less than 10,000 people per year, which means that it is due, the slight population growth is due to immigration. Finland has a notably aged population with a median age of 42 years, which is high even by the Western standards. Its birth rate is low and its death rate, owing partly to the population's aging, owing partly also to the rather unhealthy lifestyles of especially many men, is steady or even slightly rising. Still during the 21st century, the Asian and African Europeans are unlikely to unseat the Caucasian or white Europeans as the demographic majority, because their percentages of the overall European population simply are not high enough, even though their birth rates on average, are clearly higher than those of most so-called native Europeans. And of course, we have to remember that in Europe's 40-odd countries, or 50-odd countries if we include several former Soviet republics in Central Asia, there are many different shades of whiteness. So, for example, we Finns and other Northern Europeans, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, Icelanders, and Estonians, we exhibit a clearly whiter skin color than do such Southern Europeans as the Portuguese, Spaniards, Italians, and Greeks. Already, such Western Europeans as the French people, at least much more commonly than we Finns, have a dark hair, and their skin color is often at least slightly darker, although by no means always, than ours. In Central Europe, there isn't that much difference if we include in Central Europe just the majority German-speaking countries of Germany proper, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Austria. In Eastern Europe, you can already find also clearly more dark-haired people than in Northern Europe, and to some extent darker-skinned people, although this varies a lot from one region and ethnic group to another. And already these facts show how approximate, imprecise, and often arbitrary are the traditional racial categories. Fortunately, we can use the ethnic or national group categories, which are clearly more precise than the racial designations. So according to the Bible, God is no respecter of persons. In other words, for him, our ethnic or so-called racial origin is of secondary importance. Our relationship with him, whether we in our hearts want to serve him and love and obey and follow him, that is of primary importance, not our nationality or ethnicity or so-called racial origin. And in the Bible's final book, Revelations, there is a fantastic vision or prophecy of the saved people, the true followers of Jesus, worshipping him and God, or Father God, in heaven's temple. And it is said in that prophetic vision that no one, meaning no human being, could count their number. Therefore, no nation can claim to be the only righteous nation, because there will be saved people at the end of time from all tribes, nations, and even languages. Well, to get to these stereotypes about us Western immigrants living here in the Philippines, one notably widespread stereotype is, or seems to be, that we are rich, or at least richer than the Filipinos. Actually, some of us are poor, and sadly I still belong to that lower income group, although I will try hard in the next years to rise to that group of people who can at least be classified as lower middle class people, who at least always have enough money to make ends meet, even if there are sudden major expenses. Related to this income and wealth issue is an important piece of advice for some Filipino teachers and students. So you should practice that quality which is called in Tagalog delicadeza, decency. In various Western cultures, including the Finnish one where I come from, it is considered impolite to ask a fellow employee's salary, or at least traditionally it has been considered impolite, unless people are either biologically related or close friends, or one employee happens to be in a higher position in that workplace, especially if he or she is the owner or employer. Curiosity is, of course, understandable, but by no means always civilized behavior. So generally speaking, we Westerners value personal privacy, also as far as our incomes are concerned, quite much. And then the Filipino teachers should emphasize our ethnic diversity. Despite the fact that, yes, most of us white Western-born people who live here in the Philippines more or less regularly are Americans, or at least of partial American origin, having at least one American parent or grandparent. However, once again a caveat, significant minorities of us are not Americans. There are Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, us Europeans, and even white South Africans living here in the Philippines alongside the white American immigrants. And of course, among the American immigrants, there are also African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. One African American who is quite famous in the sports-related groups is Ms. Eres Pada, who is the coach of the Adamson University's ladies volleyball team. And just like the Asians generally, and the Southeastern Asians, like the Filipinos particularly, are not all the same, even we Westerners or whites are not all the same. And because the United States, like Canada, is a nation of immigrants, even the dominant, mostly white ethnic minority here in the Philippines, the Americans, come from many different ethnic origins. And of course, even back in the United States, a significant minority of the people are other than whites. Another stereotype which needs to be broken is the impression by some Filipinos that a clear or great majority of us are business people. While many of us are probably involved in business, and we do practice many other occupations, including information technology, customer service, academia, teaching, research, and then public relations, media, social work, activism, Christian and other religious work or ministry, etc. And then the next important piece of advice for some Filipino teachers and students, I've had personal experience of this, also school administrators or owners, is that if a Western immigrant identifies him or herself, for example, as an evangelical Protestant, let alone a Pentecostal or a charismatic Christian, you should not automatically assume that he or she is a missionary. Yes, there were times in the 19th and 20th century where a major portion of the white immigrants were missionaries. Nowadays, relatively few are at least regular missionaries, ordained, officially supported missionaries. There are more short-term or fixed-term missionaries who are spent here only some days, weeks, months, or at most maybe 1 or 2 years. And then it should also be assumed that if a person identifies him or herself as an evangelical Christian, a Pentecostal, or a charismatic Christian, that he or she not only believes in God, but also in Jesus Christ as his or her personal Savior, or as the Lordship Salvationists like to say, Lord and Savior. Yes, I'm aware of the traditional Catholic doctrine, nulla salus ex ecclesia, or vice versa. In other words, there is no salvation outside the ecclesia. As a Bible-believing evangelical Protestant, I believe that the ecclesia refers to the group of true followers of Jesus, regardless of their official or informal memberships in various Christian churches or other organizations. And because the true Christians come from all nations, we should add that they also come from many different Christian churches and fellowships. So most of us white Protestant immigrants here in the Philippines have no official Christian ministerial ordination, either as pastors, missionaries, evangelists, deacons, theologians, or even elders. And besides, because through God's grace, here in the Philippines, the freedom of religion is basically unlimited. We do not have to hide our possible missions ministries. We can tell right off the bat. Filipinos don't have to ask if we're missionaries. We can tell. And if missions ministry happens to be our calling, for example, me, it is not. Lay witnessing about Jesus is. Alongside school teaching, of course. And possibly video making and so forth. And writing. So if missions ministry happens to be our calling, we can openly work as missionaries here. There are quite many Asian countries where sadly that is not possible because of either their clearly non-Christian, non-biblical religion. Here I'm referring especially to many Muslim countries, especially those who practice strict forms of Islam. Not only is Islam the state religion, but the religious minorities are discouraged and intimidated, persecuted, and so forth. Think of Iran or Saudi Arabia, for example, or Maldives or Yemen. There are fortunately more moderate Muslim countries, but even there, such as in Indonesia and Malaysia, missions ministries, at least coming from religions other than Islam, including Christianity, are not encouraged. And in such countries, Christian missionaries often have to work in so-called secular occupations, for example, as teachers, linguists, researchers, medical doctors, nurses, and so forth. So personally, I have no Christian ministerial ordination, therefore I'm a lay Christian. A stereotype about us Western immigrants which has touched me personally is that we, or many of us, will return to our native lands if we lose our jobs here. So when I was informed at one college here in Metro Manila in November 2017 that I could no longer teach there, I could not get any course loads for that semester. Some students thought that I would return to Finland, and in fact the class advisor of one senior high school class whom I had taught in the first semester had told them, at least one of the students related to me, that I would return to Finland. I had to quickly correct that wrong impression. For your information, I have no serious plan to return to Finland unless there is some major political, economic, social, or financial or military crisis here. That is why I'm currently seeking teaching work here in Metro Manila, and sooner or later, with God's help, I will succeed in finding a regular and preferably full-time teaching work. Of course, I do want to visit Finland from time to time, and God willing, in 2019 I will again spend some or several weeks there with my wife. Yes, I do know that some Westerners live on a working visa here in the Philippines, and once it expires, if they cannot find another work here, they will leave the Philippines We met a few times, a Finnish lady who was here from May 2014 to May 2015 on a working visa. A related stereotype about some of us Western immigrants among some Filipinos, not all, seems to be that we are only here to make a lot of money and to profit at the expense of Filipinos. Sadly, this stereotype has some truth to it. Fortunately, as far as I understand matters, there are many Westerners here who seek to work for the good of Filipinos and of the Philippines. And I want to be one of such Westerners. Another stereotype about us Western immigrants is that we consider Filipinos as foolish and inferior people and want to take advantage of Filipinos in various ways. Unfortunately, some such Westerners live here in the Philippines, and there are also some Westerners who are deeply prejudiced about or against the Filipinos and the Philippines, and who do not even try to learn anything important about them or about their culture. So I do not fortunately belong to such Westerners, even though I've had to endure my share of name-calling and mocking laughter here since immigrating to the Philippines in November 2014. However, that name-calling and laughing has rather steadily decreased since about February 2015 already. To conclude this list of stereotypes about us Western immigrants, I will mention one more such distorted idea. In other words, should we get married with Filipinos, we want to persuade them to move to Western countries with us. And also this stereotype is partly true, although in quite many cases those Filipinos, especially Filipina ladies, themselves want to immigrate to Western countries to have, for example, a higher standard of living, more occupational and other opportunities. But a significant number of Westerners who are married to Filipinos, including myself, want to stay here provided that we find sufficient work to make ends meet and we remain reasonably healthy. Okay. Thank you so much for reading through this improvised essay. Sorry for any negative impressions about myself or about Filipinos. I did not intend to give you any such impressions. Intercultural and interethnic dialogue and stereotype breaking are certainly needed now in the 21st century global village where we live. Take care, God bless, and see you, hopefully, someday.